the Endace Packet Forensic Files with your host, Michael Morris. This episode's very special guest is Lionel Jacobs, Senior Partner Engineer and Security Expert in ICS and SCADA Systems. Lionel, welcome. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yes, thank you, Michael. A pleasure to be here. So I have been with Palo Alto Networks 9 years come August 14th, but before that, for 25 years, I worked in the energy sector, in the OT space, specifically process engineering, specializing in communications, reverse engineering systems, bringing it all together. So 25 years of working for the electrical grid, pipeline companies, helping them to customize and build out these critical infrastructure systems that are now being attached to more resources for data and stuff to make better decisions.
Now, we're excited to have you as part of our vidcast series. It's a very unique space, but it's becoming mission critical in terms of security for so many different environments. So let's start by kind of getting your perspective on what are the unique security challenges and considerations when it comes to securing critical infrastructure, such as power plants or water treatment facilities that rely on ICS and SCADA systems.
Yeah, Michael, no, great question. So the uniqueness of these systems is really they're not too far off from IT systems, right? They're typically anywhere from 7, 10, 15 years behind. If you're old enough to remember setting a dip switch, most of these systems are still out there running. They're older and they're built to last, right?
Right.
Especially once they've been paid for and they're still running. There's really no reason to change them. So the uniqueness of the system, or the thing that makes them so vulnerable, is the fact that security slows response. And because we're talking about critical infrastructure and systems where if something goes wrong, the sooner they can take control and shut it down, the better off we all are. Mm-hmm. And with security, as you've seen, be it coming through the front door with extra locks or logging into email, it slows response. And we're talking about situations where seconds count. And not to mention, we get a lot of people about, well, why don't you just use biometrics, fingerprints? But remember, when you're working in critical infrastructure and maybe something has gone wrong, maybe a valve is blown up or something has flown loose and injured the person that's working, if it's a retinal scan, if they got hit in the face, that eye may not be available anymore. If something has blown off, they may have lost the fingers needed to log in, right? Or they can't type it in, but they're still functional and they can take control of the system and bring it down gracefully. So security slows response. So that is going to be what really makes these things vulnerable. Is when we built them years ago, security wasn't an issue because we relied on security through obscurity, and they weren't as heavily connected as they are now.
No, that's you bring the reality of there's a lot more physical risks in some of these environments to people as well that a lot of us in just the cyber world don't think about. So I think that's an excellent point. So how do you assess the vulnerabilities and potential threats to an ICS SCADA environment in order to design really effective security measures?
So yeah, no, great question. There's a number of ways of doing this. They still typically align with the best practices that an IT person would use. We just get a little bit more extreme. What are you afraid of? Who is out to get you, right? So because it's critical infrastructure, and we've all seen, I can't remember the rule of 3, but basically it boils down to you can only go so many days without water, so many days without food, so many days without X, Y, Z, right? So we're talking critical infrastructure. What happens if someone gets into the nation's system and contaminates the water? It's a problem. If they shut off the power during the heat wave that we're going through, it's a problem. They shut off the power and it's freezing. It's a problem, right? So when you can affect critical infrastructure, you weaken a nation or a city or a group's ability to move. So for critical infrastructure, because of how we design them, and there's not a lot of security within the system, right? We still operate off of that M&M model is what they used to call it, right? A hardened shell protecting the GUI inside. whereas now everyone is moving towards more zero trust, least privilege, where you've got soft spots baked inside of a cookie, I think is John Kindervon summarizes it best. We don't always have those hard baked areas around the soft spots. So if someone can get in there intentionally or unintentionally, there's a possibility that they could disrupt service to the point where it has a major negative impact. So we have to look at one, the environment. How is it connected? Who are we afraid of getting into the system? And at this point, with the wars going on and everything, we always have to think nation state is out to get us. So most of these operators are thinking in terms of someone that's well sponsored and an interest in crippling our operations for the nation as the attacker, right? And we're seeing that more with the reports that are coming out. We saw it a few years ago with the Colonial Pipeline. So these are all things that they're really starting to come to light. And then also keep in mind, ransomware is really a business now. And because they know that these systems are needed to run, if I can get in there and I can encrypt it and hold your data hostage and force you to pay, there's a strong possibility that the utility will pay to restore service, depending on which one it is.
Yeah. No, and you mentioned something earlier in your answer too. These systems have a lengthy process to shut down properly, right? Otherwise, they may be offline for a while, right? So, being able to respond quickly is critical. Can you provide examples of some best practices for implementing secure network segmentation and access controls within a SCADA environment?
Yeah, absolutely. So the best practices are going to align with zero trust, NIST, everything else that's out there as far as least privilege, right? Who needs to be in there is always going to be the first question that you should ask. What is their job function? Do they need to be in there? What access do they need, right? Then we also have to look at where they're operating from. If you have an operator, you really have to know your people's schedules and how they work or be fairly familiar. If an operator is all of a sudden trying to log in from China and they're supposed to be in Singapore or the United States, those are red flags. So now you got to start watching what they're doing. So what access do they have? And then keep in mind, because a lot of these facilities and the assets they protect are remote, you also have to look at upstream attacks now, because it's very easy for someone to ride out to a location where they know there's no one around, displace a device or assume its identity, and then launch an attack from within that secure environment back towards the enterprise. Because as a general rule, and this is starting to change now, but OT is considered secure. So secure talks to less secure and not less secure to more secure. So if the policies are in place to allow me to communicate and do more coming from OT than vice versa, it becomes easier for attackers to compromise our environment and move into the enterprise. So both sides put each other at risk. And so how we go about assessing the best practices are ultimately going to boil down to what is the function that person's job does or that device does, what does it need to talk to, and then restricting it down to that. But as with anything, the assessment of identifying those assets and determining what's critical and what's not critical is the first step. And that's more of paperwork or spreadsheets or however you want to do that, identifying it and then putting proper security measures around it to ensure that no harm can be done or you limit the blast radius, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I've heard a number of stories of where these separate network segments are becoming more accidentally connected, right? In the sense of you got your business network versus your infrastructure network, right?
What it tends to happen is back doors are put in place so that people can get in and have access to certain things at certain times of the day.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them are not meant maliciously. So again, that goes back to doing an assessment of the environment, learning what all the connections are. Someone's bringing a wireless hub so that they can move around the facility and not have to always plug in. Well, that just caused a problem because it's on that network, and the range that wireless has can be quite far. And then
Right.
someone with malicious intent with a Yagi antenna pointed back in, well, you just gave them an opening, right? So it's a lot of thinking in terms of security and the impact of what I put in and how I put in, just being mindful. And typically, people in this environment are very mindful of what they do and how they do it. Especially the older generation, they don't want to disrupt anything.
Right.
However, newer generations, younger generations are coming in. They believe in efficiency. They believe in automation. They understand technology, and they understand how this can help them to get their job done quicker and more effectively. So now you have to try and balance that out to where they're not creating a vulnerability while trying to improve their efficiencies.
Right. Now, you brought up a good point a little bit ago too about how do you address the issue of legacy systems in critical infrastructures. Many of these devices may not have built-in security features or regular software updates. Certainly can't apply, new software solutions necessarily to the physical devices. So how do you kind of merge that all together?
No, great question. And that's where IEC 62443 comes in, zones and conduits, putting them, which goes back to that very first thing of doing the assessment of what's critical, what's needed to protect it, and then putting it in a zone. So if I've got an old Windows machine that can't be patched, most of them won't be patched for a number of reasons, or they're lagging behind in patch. And just so that everyone is aware that, I'm sure there's some that are uninitiated into how the process world works. Patching a machine is just as dangerous as not patching a machine, because that patch that's put out there by Microsoft or whoever the vendor is could take that machine out of running spec or cause it to lock up because of all the specialty stuff that's on there. So patching is just as dangerous as not patching. So these teams typically run the patch on an isolated system for several months and determine if it's good, and then they deploy it. So there'll always be a version or two behind on patching. So that is one of the safeguards, even though it's still a deficiency. So the best way that I think the industry is seeing is if I can put all of these devices that have a similar vulnerability into a enclave or zone, and then put a remediating factor in front of it to help isolate it and protect it from things that are coming towards it or may get in there and try and go out, that's going to be the most efficient way. It's scalable. It's something that can be done without bringing down the system. And then people don't realize, yes, these systems are old, but they're very expensive to replace, because it's not like I'm running on Windows 7, now I want to go to Windows 11. Well, when the vendor comes in of that control system, you have to pay them to rework all of that code to run on Windows 11 based off of your old system, and that gets quite expensive. And then when you look at it, it's on a per plant basis, because even though the plants may look identical, I guarantee they're like fingerprints, they're different, right? Somebody else put a spin on it that makes it run differently but more efficiently for that area. So what's being done on plan A can't necessarily be done on plan B.
Right. No, that's a great point. How do you or can you discuss the role of security monitoring and incident detection within these types of environments? What are some effective techniques and tools used in this context?
No, great question. So now that they're learning more about what can be done, right? I was remembering reading a study where even though you're able to see a packet and look in it, be Modbus or whatever it is, someone that really knows what they're doing can go deeper in that stack and flip a bit that when the intrusion detection or the monitoring sees it, it looks right, but it could cause that PLC or RTU to run in a destabilized state over time, right? So it's a little bit different than what you would do for IT, because it is a very specialized field and how these control system protocols work. So, but it's no different than IT, right? You need someone that is capturing these logs, that's storing them for the appropriate number of days, and when something pops up, that can actually go through, look at it, or at least talk to the stakeholders and find out, is this right? Should we be concerned? So monitoring is always going to be important, just like baseline. one of the first things that we would always recommend someone do in a controls environment after whether it's green or brownfield, right? You have to have a running baseline on what you think normal is, even though it will vary, to always reference back to, because sometimes things change so subtly over time to where you don't notice it. And if I can go back 6 months and run the simulation through whatever and see that change, I have a good idea of where to go to fix it. So capturing logs and that data is very important. It's how you're going to find out what's going sideways.
Right. No, that's an excellent point there. How do you approach the challenge of ensuring the integrity and authenticity of log data and packet data exchanged within an ICS SCADA environment, especially considering the critical nature of the real-time response, right? You've got to, obviously at Palo, many malware today has wipers and spoofing devices. I mean, we're even seeing in our environments, embedded data inside DNS traffic, right? So how do you ensure the integrity and authenticity?
Wow, yeah, no, great question. And that's a very complicated question.
Yeah.
Again, going back to what I was saying up front, a lot of people would like to use things like an IPsec tunnel, whatever, between devices. But again, that adds a level of complexity. Typically, inside of the environment, devices are trusted to communicate east to west with each other. But putting a tap in and using certain products that just capture all of the data, be it something that open source like Wireshark, is a great way to begin, because at least you have the data and you can go back and start to look through it and determine what's going on. That also goes back to that initial baseline. Any new plant that's built as things are turned up, it's always great to have that baseline of the build out process, and then that golden baseline of, hey, we got everything working as well as we can, or it's perfect. Let's baseline and capture this data and make sure. So when you get inside of the cell and you start trying to monitor that, probably the best way to do it is always going to be just have a span point that's capturing all the data and putting it someplace so that as things arise, you can go and pull it back and start trying to figure out what went wrong. But yet, as you pointed out earlier, there's so many devices that can't take upgrades, can't take enhancements, do not have security stacks built into them, to where it becomes quite tricky on how you do that. And there's no silver bullet for that, right? Other than just capture the data, capture meaningful data, because you can't get into information overload, right? Yeah. SIMs are great, things that can automate, but again, it goes back to having people that truly understand. And I guess that's what I probably should have said first and foremost. And one of the biggest problems that security people in the OT environment have is, one, there are very few out there that truly understand how OT is supposed to work and what happens when security goes wrong, right? And having someone that can actually look at that log and read it and understand what's not right about it, there are very few of those. I do see more coming into existence. And as the technology between OT starts to catch up with IT, again, you've got open source API.org and some of the others that are working to make it to where you can take Raspberry Pi and do certain things and not be vendor locked.
Right.
That knowledge is becoming more and more available, but still there's still a learning curve for a lot of people.
No, you brought up an excellent point there of having the data in context, right? That's why obviously we, with our packet data, like to provide it in the context of many of the Palo Alto solutions like Panorama or Cortex, so that they can simplify those investigations. So excellent point there. You mentioned people and processes at least a couple times in this conversation so far. Can you share some insights on the importance of collaboration and information sharing between various stakeholders, whether it's the security teams, the infrastructure operators, government agencies, the security vendors, whatever it may be, to really enhance the security of these environments?
Yeah, no, another great question. And collaboration is definitely going to be key. Operators tend to hold things very close to the vest because they don't want to put their production at risk. They're very protective of it. Obviously, it's how they earn their living. They understand, but it's always a safety first culture, right? If you've ever worked in one of these sites, making sure that everyone goes home at the end of the day is really what's important, and that no one around us is harmed in, the process of us doing our business. So collaboration is important, clear communication as to what needs to happen. And I think a lot of security people trying to get into OT have to spend the time and go out there and actually learn what these teams do. I understood back in the early 90s when I started. It wasn't until my boss made me go out to the field and actually spend a couple of months out there working with them and understanding how they do this stuff that I could appreciate when I called with a question. It had to have true relevance, because I'm taking them away from doing something that's important, right? That's keeping someone safe. And when you sit behind a desk all day and you do not understand the danger of what could go wrong, while I'm sitting here trying to explain to you that I don't understand what you're asking me for, and there's an H2S tank sitting right next to me that could go off any second. You understand why they get irritable, because a lot of times it doesn't look like anybody's really out there to help. So collaboration is important. I'd always encourage, if you have the ability to go out there and spend some time with them, learn what they do, give them a hand. They appreciate this. And then when you call them and have a question, they're always willing and able to help you, because they see that you care. It's not just a job. Again, it's everybody goes home at the end of the day. That's the ultimate end game, and nobody's lost, be it our people or the surrounding community. So, but it does take some time, and they have to trust you with this information, because again, it's, what could go wrong.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of information, right? And sometimes it's not in a digital format. You've got to talk to someone. You've got to find that person that has it written down on that handkerchief that can take a picture and send it to you and then explain it. So collaboration is going to be key in securing these environments, because if you don't know how it works, you can't secure it. And most important to them, if you're going to secure it, I need to know how you're going to back out of it if it's not right, and how quickly you can do that. So again, the longer they're down, the longer production is offline, money's lost, systems become at risk, right?
No, you brought up some excellent points there. My father used to work at a power plant when I was young, and it's a totally different environment. And until you've been inside one, it's and I don't even know the security side of it. I was young when I toured it, right? But it's a different world. So it's an excellent point. What kind of emerging technologies or trends do you foresee impacting the security of ICS and SCADA systems in the near future, and how should organizations really prepare for them?
Yeah, no, again, another great question, a very hard question to answer. Again, smarter workforces are developing, right? Because these systems, well, let me back up a little bit. The newer technologies is definitely helping us find efficiencies and run these things more cost effective, more efficiently, period, right? Which requires that connectivity.
Mm-hmm.
So smarter workforces are obviously going to evolve from this. And with that connectivity and the data moving in and out and decisions being made, it's opening it up to vulnerabilities. I don't see that trend changing, especially with, like I said, the Paris Accords coming into play, trying to lower the greenhouse effects, be more efficient or better stewards of our energy and our other natural resources. So, securing them ultimately is going to boil down to people, processes, and things. We have to educate our people as to, if you do this, this is the risk you put us at.
Mm-hmm.
Having clearly defined processes and teaching people to, if it doesn't seem right, if there's something questionable, say something, we need to act on that. And, it's a very tough question for the energy sector, because everything that is designed to really help us, right? IoT, which I know IoT doesn't exist in OT. We have IIoT, right? But they're putting in similar type devices that feed data in and make those communications. And if those things aren't secured, it puts us all at risk. It's a very tough question to answer.
Yeah.
Other than just completely putting them on their own isolated networks and never allowing communication out.
Right.
But that's not going to happen because, again, everyone wants to be in control of their energy usage and understand where their money's going. I don't really know how to answer that, but the trend is definitely going to still be towards smarter OT networks that provide efficiencies and provide new products and services. I mean, that's what people want.
No, that's a great point. And you mentioned IoT, IIoT. They're blending, right? I mean, people are putting smart switches and security cameras in these types of environments, so they have more visibility, right? Frankly, both to the physical as well as the digital, and so those environments are blending, and it's you brought up some excellent points there.
Well, the funny
So
thing
Lionel,
is,
one of my last questions I always like to ask our industry experts like yourself, be a prognosticator for us. What's one thing you'd recommend to our listeners to really think about or look out for over the next 6 to 18 months in the ever-shifting battle for cybersecurity?
yeah, that's another. You've asked me a lot of tough questions here.
Sorry, man.
Obviously, having that data as to what's going across your network and how it's communicating is paramount, right?
Right.
Even when everything is designed right, that data gives you insight as to your current run state, if it's good, if it's bad, where to go back and look for possible problems. So I would always advocate the collecting of logs. And if you can leverage a system like yours that makes it very easy to tie into, and I'm going to speak agnostically, a firewall system, and then drill back and start to look at what happened. Firewalls are great tools, right? When I was working in process engineering, the team that I managed handled all of that, right? Network, routing, switching, the building of the servers. We did all of that. They had that skill set. And I can honestly say, just based on the logs and what was going back and forth between the firewalls and the endpoints, they could tune the system faster than the everyday automation person because they had end-to-end insight as to what was going wrong. They saw it when it left the device, when it hit the firewall, when it passed the other point, and the connection. So they could look and say, okay, well, it's not connecting. And effect change or help to effect change, or they could see the inside the packet what was going awry and make the corrections or tell people how to make the corrections. So it's a powerful tool to be able to look into that and see what's going on. Look for those error codes, multiple devices communicating. So no, log collection is huge. Baselining or having something that can go back and at least offer you some semblance of a baseline is important. So I would always advocate collecting the logs, baselining, but being sure to filter it down to meaningful information. And what I do like about the way your product works, when I was going through the integration and looking at it, it did allow me, at least in my own opinion, that even if I'd never baselined, there's so much information out there, there's information overload, that it allowed me to click and then drill down onto what my gut was telling me was the significant event and group that together. And if I was wrong, then I could find another point. But eventually it's the filter, right, that lets me narrow down to help with that. And I think that's huge.
No, thank you. It's an excellent point. I mean, certainly that's what we try and provide jointly with you guys. The power of all the security detection you guys can provide with the full packet data, right? Complementing all that log information with every transaction on the network. So, Lionel, I want to thank you for taking the time to share your tremendous experience and insights in how to better secure ICS and SCADA networks. We'd ask our listeners to tune in next time for another edition of the Endace Packet Forensic Files. For more information about Endace's network packet capture platform and our integration with our fusion technology partners like Palo Alto, please go to endace.com. Lionel, again, thanks for taking the time with us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.